Good evening, I'm Gavin Jackson. Welcome to South Carolina ETV and South Carolina Public Radio's coverage of the 2024 election. The polls have just closed across the state, and we will follow the results as they are reported. We will also be getting live feeds from watch parties here in Columbia, where South Carolina Public Radio reporters Felicia Edie is with the Democrats and Mayan Schechter with the Republicans. Here in studio to discuss the races and what it means is University of South Carolina Political Science Chair Kirk Randazzo, and joining us via Skype is Winthrop Political Science Professor and author of the Winthrop Poll, Scott Huffman. Kirk, let's start with you. You're here. Thanks for joining us. We always have you here during these big nights. Tell us what you're watching. Of course, the polls have just closed in South Carolina. We have no results, and we might not have them for a while. So what are you watching? It's finally Election Day. The polls are closed in South Carolina.
I think I'm watching pretty much what everybody else is watching. Obviously, the presidential race, since it's been so close and really been a historic race with Biden dropping out early, Harris joining in and having the momentum, and Trump having to pivot with candidates. But I think the other thing I'm watching is the congressional races. Both the House and the Senate have razor-thin majorities for either side, and I'm checking to see the extent to which those flip partisan control.
And Scott, let's jump to you just to follow up on what Kirk was talking about there before we see our reporters in the field. You're a pollster. There have been nonstop polls going on in the swing states and nationally. But tell us what you're seeing, how close things really are this election.
Obviously, the phrase toss-up gets overused, and it is unfortunately a little bit accurate this time. One of the things we have to wonder is the polling swinging back a little too much? And here's what I mean by that. Trump was underestimated in 2016, especially in the traditional blue wall states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Trump was actually also underestimated in 2020. Biden beat him, but not by as much as the polls were saying. So there's been a lot of correction. And so this time, the polls, the legitimate polls, took two paths. Some weighted by past votes and some didn't. And the other thing that might be going on is herding. Just like you might herd sheep, some of the polls might be herding, afraid to sort of get out on a limb. And so some outliers that might show one candidate a little further out and be a little more accurate might not be the ones that are showing up. But you look at 538, things like that are polling aggregators. Again, it's just showing it too incredibly tight, margin of error stuff in the battleground states and, of course, nationally.
And before we jump to Mayan, I just want to ask you, Scott, following up on that, when we talk about these close polls, it always seems like it's close. Is this one more so than others, or how do you make a read on this election versus others?
Well, again, last election, you had several states that were won by 0.3 and sometimes less. We're going to see that going in this time. Now, there is truly virtually no way for even the best poll to, nail it right on there if you're just talking about, 0.2% of the vote. John Ralston, who's famous for predicting Nevada correctly, predicts Harris will win Nevada by 0.2%. I don't know how you can go out on a limb and predict that. The polls there have been sort of up in the air, but it's a battleground state. It's one of the Sun Belt states that is a key path for Trump, especially if Harris gets the Rust Belt states. But that's the kind of margin we're talking about, and polls are just not designed to pick that up. They are snapshots of what people are thinking at that moment. They are really not the predictors that sort of people imagine them to be.
Yeah, and so much has happened over the past few days that may not have been picked up in polls, too. We'll talk about that in a moment. But let's head over to the Republican headquarters where Mayan Schechter is. Mayan, how's the mood over there?
Hey, Gavin, I am at Tin Roof in Columbia, just right across the street from the South Carolina Statehouse, here with the South Carolina Republican Election Night Watch Party. The crowd is growing, and the way I would describe their mood right now, they are calm, they are confident, and they are unbothered. We've already heard Drew McKissick, the chair of the South Carolina Republican Party, say that they think they'll be able to flip 2 seats in the South Carolina Senate and 2 seats in the South Carolina House of Representatives. So this is a crowd that is feeling pretty good. We have seen Congressman Joe Wilson, his son, Attorney General Alan Wilson. We've also seen some lawmakers show up, including Lexington Republican Representative Micah Caskey. So right now, the crowd is feeling pretty good. We did hear a moment ago that South Carolina was too early to call, but they felt that former President Trump was up in the state, and we heard a big applause around here. So the mood is pretty high right now at Tin Roof in Columbia.
And Mayan, just to pick up on that a little bit, we're talking about those 2 House, 2 Senate districts that Drew has consistently said that they hope to pick up. Any other seats that they're watching, possible surprises tonight that people are talking about, or is that also just too soon to speculate on? Okay. We didn't get Mayan there, but we'll follow up on that question, too, because we'll be watching those state house races on top of those congressional district races, too, because there are no statewide races here in South Carolina this go around. But we do have Thalisha Edie, who's over with the Democrats. Thalisha, what's the mood over there with the Democrats?
Hey, Gavin, I am at the Beer Keller Brewing Company in Columbia. This is where local leaders in the Democratic Party in both Richland and Lexington counties are gathering to watch tonight's returns and hopefully celebrate victories for their candidates. This is a nice, small, intimate setting, but the crowd is coming in. We have people with signs, and we are expecting to see the South Carolina chair of the Democratic Party, Crystal Spain. She's expected to be here tonight, along with Congressman James Clyburn. He is expected to be here tonight as well. But in this small, intimate space, we see the range of voters, from our dignitaries, high-ranking officials within the Democratic Party, but also everyday citizens. Earlier this evening, I had the chance to talk with a mom and a daughter. The mom, who is from the Greenview community in Columbia, she brought her young daughter along because she said she wanted to celebrate democracy. She says within her house, it's a very big and important thing. So a lot of people trickling in. We're in downtown Columbia at the Beer Keller Brewing Company in Columbia. People are filing in, enjoying some good food, enjoying fellowship, and hopefully for the Democrats, enjoying some victories as well. Back to you.
All right, Felicia, we'll jump to you in a bit. Thanks for touching base with us. But Kirk, I want to kind of just talk about what we're going to be seeing tonight. Obviously, South Carolina is not one of those swing states like our neighbors, North Carolina and Georgia. Georgia, the polls close there at 7 o'clock, just like ours did, and North Carolina will close at 7:30. But when we talk about South Carolina being a solid red state, we look back to the 2020 election when Donald Trump won the state by 12 points, and that obviously trickles down the ballot too, and all 9 electoral college votes here in the state. So, I mean, when it comes to that, and you talk about Trump declaring victory before we know the results in all the other states, I mean, how worrisome is that for a candidate to get ahead of the actual results coming in? For South Carolina, that's one thing. We know who's going to win here. But when we look at these swing states, we'll still be counting for whoever knows how long. It has to be a little worrisome when someone comes out and says, I already won, don't worry about the other ballots.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big concerns is, will Trump declare himself the winner? And if so, when will that happen? Will it be when other states are still voting before their polls have closed? Will it be after that has happened? And all of this harkens back to other close elections. Probably the one that immediately comes to mind is 2000 between George W. Bush and Al Gore. Initially, there were projections that Gore won Florida, and then later on, no, it turned out that Bush won Florida. And so when you have those kinds of definitive statements come out, it puts a certain image in people's minds. And when that image doesn't stay, then that just increases a sense of frustration. And so if you fast forward now to the last 4 years, there were allegations of fraud and misconduct and denials of election results. And for the last 4 years, those same denials have been put forward constantly in front of voters. And so now you have an electorate that very much is untrustful of the electoral institutions. And if a candidate comes out and just arbitrarily declares themselves the winner, all that does is really increase that mistrust. And we know we're probably not going to sort this out for a good 2, 3, 4 days, maybe even longer, depending on if there are recounts, when absentee ballot votes have to be counted, if there are legal challenges. This is likely going to drag out for several days.
And Scott, like Kirk was saying there, talking about, this trickle-down effect of distrust in public institutions. How worrisome is that when we see what has played out over the past 4 years, what happened on January 6th, for example? How worried are you about how things could result from this election?
Well, I think a lot of us are concerned that, violence is actually possible. After January 6th, which none of us thought could happen, that's been floating around in our minds. What we know is half the population is going to be apoplectic about the results. The question is, will they accept the results? And Kirk just got into that about, how people have been primed to absolutely not accept the results. Any misstep among the ballots, if a computer goes down or something, it's going to be jumped on as if it's part of some grand conspiracy. Well, that happens every time. Arizona, Maricopa County has over 60% of the entire population of Arizona. They have a 2-page front and back ballot that they have to vote on. That's not going to be counted within a couple of days. And if Arizona is as close and as important as it was in 2020, that could be a problem. As for the recounts, at least 4, I believe, of the 7 battleground states have an automatic recount if it's less than 0.5% difference. So we are going to go into this tomorrow and the next day and the next day, not truly knowing who won. But as Kurt pointed out, if we have a candidate who jumps out and says, I won, then that's going to erode trust in the process that, produced the most secure election in U.S. history last time, but that is no longer believed by everyone.
And Kirk, go ahead.
If I could, just to jump on one of Scott's points, I think voters just need to recognize that it is okay to take additional time to make sure that the vote is correct. I mean, I know that we all love to hear races called 5 minutes after polls close. I mean, I'm kind of the same way. I've always enjoyed that pretty much my entire life. But to make sure that we get it right takes time. And if that means we're not going to know for another couple of days, that is definitely time well spent. And I think just sort of reminding people that it is okay to pump the brakes a little bit, slow things down, make sure the count is accurate. That is not fraudulent at all. That is not a conspiracy. That is the process working the way it's supposed to work.
And that's what we've heard from State Election Commission Director Howie Knapp saying the same thing on our show recently. And we are still waiting on numbers in South Carolina. Obviously, the polls just closed about 15 minutes ago. Things are not instantaneous, for better or for worse. Right. But we're waiting. We're going to let that process play out. But I think I was just told I want to follow up some more on some numbers in a moment. But we're going to jump to Maayan Schechter because we've got her back on the line. And she has SC GOP Chairman Drew McKissick with her at the GOP watch party here in Columbia. Maayan, how's it going?
I am here with Drew McKissick, the chairman. I'm here with Drew McKissick, the chairman of the South Carolina Republican Party. I described the crowd earlier as calm, confident, unbothered. Would you say the same of the folks here tonight?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, we know what early voting looked like. I mean, we don't know how everyone voted, but we know who voted. And it was a very, very Republican crowd, overwhelmingly in early voting all across the state. And we've got good reports all day today in the areas where we need to get good reports, the races that we have targeted. We're very confident Trump will carry South Carolina by double digits, and we'll add to our majority in the Statehouse, State Senate, and win a lot of local races.
You have talked about, and you've been on the record as saying that Republicans will flip 2 seats in the South Carolina Senate and 2 seats in the South Carolina House of Representatives. Can you give us a little bit of an idea of where those races might be, considering the polls have closed?
Well, I'll say that actually I believe we're going to do better than that tonight. I think that's a conservative estimate. We could very well do double that in the House and in the Senate. The early reports that we saw in early voting make us feel very confident, and we'll wait and see till the votes get counted, but I think you're going to see that be a conservative estimate before the night's over.
Any areas of the state you might be willing to disclose where those races might be?
I don't want to get ahead of myself yet, but I think we're in good shape.
You mentioned early voting. More than 1.5 million people voted in the state. What do you attribute that to? Is that the top of the ticket? Is that the new way of voting now in South Carolina?
No, it's a couple of things. One, obviously Donald Trump embraced early voting, and that, if you will, gives some people permission who otherwise wouldn't have early voted. And you've got other people who, in terms of, well, both parties, but our party especially, has been working to turn out what we call low propensity voters, who, they'll vote Republican if they turn out and vote. They don't always turn out and vote. So we spent a lot of time and money focused on those voters to the point where by the time all early voting was accounted for, about 28% of all known Republican voters who turned out are low propensity Republicans, which means we had more voters still sitting on the bench for today than Democrats did, which again gives me great confidence about picking up those extra seats I was talking about earlier.
And speaking of those extra seats, I want to lastly ask you, there is almost a supermajority in the South Carolina Senate. There is a supermajority in the South Carolina House of Representatives. You're talking about potentially doubling what your initial assumptions were. Sometimes more members can cause more problems, as we've seen some infighting in the South Carolina House. And I'm interested in whether you are concerned at all with the higher numbers, whether we could see any of that stagnation like we've seen in Congress and D.C.
Look, my job's to win races. That's what a state chairman gets elected to do. So I win races, they deal with policy. Our primary voters pick them in the primary, and our job is to go take those candidates and win. But at the end of the day, these are people who have a lot more in common than they have in terms of disagreements. And we've got a very conservative party platform. These candidates support it, and they'll hash it out in the legislature.
And let me ask this one final question. Back in 2020, when Republicans flipped 5 seats in both the House and the Senate, Republicans talked about pushing, loosening gun restrictions, restricting abortion access, educational scholarship accounts, or what some folks call private school vouchers. What issues do you hope to see Republicans push forward if they do grow their majority?
Well, I'm not going to set priorities for the House or the Senate caucus right now, but you've heard the things that those candidates have talked about on the trail this year. And they're going to stick to their principles, and they might have some differences, but they'll come together around a consensus.
Drew, thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
Back to you, Gavin.
Thank you, Maayan. That was Maayan Schechter with SCGP Chairman Drew McKissick there at the Republican Watch Party. Kirk, you just heard the chairman there talking very confidently about picking up some seats. There's talk about, flipping 4 seats. He's expecting to do better than that. We're talking about the House and the state Senate. In the state Senate, there are currently 30 Republicans. In the state House, there are 87 Republicans. The state Senate's about to get a supermajority, it sounds like, which would make things easier to pass for the Republicans on their agenda. You're also seeing that body becoming more conservative, too. You saw some folks get knocked off in the primaries. So what do you think this signals for the next session coming up in January for the 2-year session, and what we could possibly be seeing coming out of the State House here in Columbia?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to see if Republicans get that supermajority, what that means for their legislative agenda. I mean, you heard in the interview with Drew the fact that in the last session there was a lot of infighting within the Republican Party. Some notable names got primaried, lost that primary. Katrina Shealy is probably the one that immediately comes to mind that might be one of the more notable figures. And so it's not just the fact that there might be a supermajority in terms of numbers. It's really the extent to which the Republican caucus will be cohesive rather than fractured. And if there's a cohesive party, then I think they will be able to push a legislative agenda that has been very difficult to do over the last several terms. But if that cohesion starts to fracture in some way, shape, or form, then we're likely going to see a lot of sort of the same types of situations where bills may pass one chamber but not pass the other, and then all of a sudden the clock expires and we've run out of time. So it's really going to be interesting to see who takes those offices and then the extent to which the party as a whole can build those relationships internally in order to get stuff done.
And Scott, before we jump to Felicia, kind of pick up on what you were hearing from Drew and what Kirk was just saying there. It sounds like a lot of turnout being driven because of the top of the ticket will lead to a more conservative Statehouse.
Well, let's remember that this is the first presidential election with the change of rules, that you no longer have to show up to one place in the county with one of 7 excuses of why you're voting early. So between the rules changes and the permission from Donald Trump, people are showing up early, and it's Republicans are showing up more than they would have otherwise, more than they did in early voting, say in North Carolina in 2020. The Statehouse is going to get more conservative. 41% of the Senate uncontested, 56% of the House uncontested. Those districts are very gerrymandered, which means you have to run far to the right or far to the left to win. That means whoever gets elected is not really representative of the average Democrat or the average Republican. So that's how you get things like the South Carolina Freedom Caucus, who's a little further to the right than the average actual Republican in South Carolina. Now they match the activists perfectly. But that can lead to infighting, and more voices just going to make that infighting a little louder.
Yeah, that's when we really see the primaries play a huge role in picking, especially these Statehouse races where it's determined sometimes as few as 20 votes or a few votes. Those determine the folks who will be on the ballot. And like you said, Scott, some don't even have opponents come the general election, too. But we're going to jump to Felicia Edie at the Democratic Party, the Watch Party there in Columbia. She has SCDP Chairwoman Crystal Spain with her. Hey, Felicia.
Hey, Gavin. Yep, we're at the Beer Keller Brewing Company that is in Columbia. And standing with me is Chair of the South Carolina Democratic Party, Crystal Spain. My first question, how are you feeling tonight? It's been a very long campaign so far.
I'm feeling good about tonight. We have laid out our plan and we've done our work and we did our work well. So, I feel good about the work that we did here in South Carolina.
I know that a lot of focus tonight is on down ballot races. Talk a little bit about some of those races.
In 2022, we lost a lot of Statehouse races, a lot more than we probably can get back, but we definitely had our eyes on about 4 of those races over in Clarendon, down in Charleston and Hampton counties. So we really ran a very targeted effort this cycle to get those seats back.
Tonight is definitely a high point. Everyone, we've been waiting for this night for a very long time. What happens tomorrow? What does the South Carolina Democratic Party need from registered voters and those who will be eligible to be registered voters? What do you need from the public tomorrow?
Tomorrow, if we want to change the state of play in South Carolina, we need folks to plug in with their county parties. There are 46 counties here. Every county has a Democratic Party. Like I said, if we want to change the state of play, we have to have a year-round volunteer-led voter engagement effort, and we can do it here, but we just have to get people plugged in and ready to work.
We're also expecting Congressman James Clyburn here tonight. What do you want people to know about all of the races, about the party, and what they can expect as they watch returns with us here tonight?
Just know that the State Democratic Party really worked hard to, like I said, pick up House seats where we could. And our other mission was to defend our incumbents in the State House and defend our incumbents in the State Senate. We're in the minority in the State Senate. We can't afford to lose one more member or we drop into the super minority. Winning those State House seats back that I talked about and holding our incumbents pulls us out of the super minority in the State House. So we've got a lot of work to do. We're clawing our way back. And so, like I said, we did a targeted effort and we're proud of the work we've done. But if we want to do more, we need all hands on deck.
And my last question, young voters and African-American voters. I remember in previous election cycles, we heard a lot about the role of African-American women within the Democratic Party. This cycle around, we're hearing American men. Talk a little bit about the role of that demographic, but then also younger voters within the party here in South Carolina.
I think that younger voters overall are ready for a change, or they're ready for a new generation of leadership. When we talk about the top of the ticket, I see those young voters breaking for Kamala Harris. And when we talk about the top of the ticket, when it comes to black men, I saw that she closed that gap with black men. That wasn't her problem, but it was a party problem. And again, that is something that the party has to solve in the off cycle when we're doing that voter engagement to get black voters, to get young voters engaged in the Democratic Party again.
Crystal Spain, Chair of the South Carolina Democratic Party. Thank you so very much. Again, Gavin, we are at their Beer Keller Brewing Company, downtown Columbia. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Felicia. Glad that we've already talked to both of our state party heads. As you can hear at all their watch parties, it's kind of a very lively event. But we have a full page of graphics here. Obviously, as you can see, we don't have all of our counties voting yet. I believe that's Chesterfield County so far reporting. And then I cannot place the other county, and Kershaw County too. And looking at that, we still have to wait for a lot of results to come in, as we've been talking about. It's a slow process, but that's the process, folks. But when we look, Kirk, at how the reading of the state and how we're not a swing state, and we look at other states like North Carolina, which is very purple, Georgia, which actually went for Joe Biden in 2020, we're becoming redder, and that's because of a lot of in-migration to our state. In fact, only 13 counties went for Joe Biden back in 2020, and it wasn't Chesterfield or Kershaw County. In fact, there's a lot of PD counties and some of the Midlands counties. So we're seeing a reddening of the state. And where do you see that growth happening? Where could we potentially see another congressional district come online in 2030?
Well, in terms of the congressional district, I think that's an interesting question, given that we should have seen that in this map, and it didn't happen. So we've continued with the old map. I think what we're going to see is a legislature that will increasingly carve out space to gerrymander districts that would favor the political power of the Republican Party. And we see that pretty much in every state. So this isn't necessarily a unique thing to South Carolina. In terms of the fact that we're growing redder rather than purple or something along those lines, I mean, you hit part of it. You know, it's just the demographics coming in, the folks moving into South Carolina, by and large, are conservative individuals. And if you think about things, North Carolina, Georgia in particular, have a couple of large urban sort of centers that tend to, the urban centers tend to be more democratic in nature, and they just have large populations that tend to dominate the state. South Carolina doesn't really have that. I mean, Columbia, Charleston, Greenville, Spartanburg, but folks in the upstate are by and large very conservative. Columbia, Charleston, maybe lean a bit more progressive, but certainly not enough to offset the upstate. And then the rural areas tend to be still very conservative in nature. And so South Carolina is really not going to move in any meaningful way towards a battleground state in a short period.
And Scott, picking up on that, when we look at the PD getting redder, we could potentially see some flips in that area too when it comes to at least the Statehouse level. And then you just heard SCDP Chairwoman Crystal Spain talking about trying to do their best, trying to reach voters in these places. But it seems like they're losing a lot of ground that they used to take for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. And to follow up on what Kirk said, the way we look at the South has changed. So those of us who study the South, it used to be the Deep South and the Peripheral South, or Rim South. Now we sort of look at it as the growth South and the stagnant South. Among the growth South, South Carolina is kind of the exception. Every other growth South state, like Georgia, like North Carolina, are becoming more purple for exactly the reason Kirk said, that people are coming in to the urban areas. They're younger, they're coming for higher paying jobs, they have college level education or higher, they're voting Democratic. So Charlotte is becoming bluer, Winston-Salem, the Triangle area, Atlanta makes up 40% of the entire population of Georgia. So that's becoming more purple. And those red counties, they are losing population. And as they do, they become redder, but lower population. So those states become purple, not South Carolina. As you noted, the people coming in tend to be retirees. A lot of them from the north. They have some native conservatism. They retire from up north. They come down here. They vote the Republican Party, and we are a growing state that is getting redder, and that is very different from the other southern states that are growing.
Yeah, a good point, Scott. That's something we always kind of touch on when we talk about these swing states versus solid red Republican South Carolina. Again, which makes it difficult for not only the president to win here, the presidential candidate to win here, but also these congressional districts that we've been talking about that have been gerrymandered based off of the maps that have been drawn in the South Carolina Statehouse, which is controlled by Republicans. We will soon be getting some congressional numbers here too. But Scott, we're not expecting to see any big changes when it comes to what happens with who's in Congress besides Sherry Biggs, who's going to be the newest member of Congress in that 3rd congressional district. They're replacing Jeff Duncan.
Yeah, that's kind of the most interesting one to watch, even though we sort of already know the outcome. Those districts were gerrymandered, all the way back to when the 7th district was first drawn, when we first got a 7th district. That Senate version of the 7th district actually would have been potentially a Democratic pickup, although it was going to be dominated by Republicans. The House version of the 7th district made it more strongly Republican. That's the one we ended up with. So it got picked up for the first time by a Republican. And then the latest round of sort of changing the borders a little bit, it got even redder, as did the 1st district. And the 1st district got a lot safer for Nancy Mace. So again, there's no real surprises in our congressional districts this time around.
I know I hate to be a spoiler there. We can talk about that in a minute, Kirk, but I think we have some graphics here to show you in terms of early results for those congressional races. And U.S. House District 3 there with Brian Best, 28%, and Sherry Biggs, we were just talking about that, at 68%. We expect that to be pretty much the going rate here when it comes to what happens in that race. Of course, Sherry Biggs being the newest congressional member in our delegation there. House District 5 with Congressman Ralph Norman, a solid Republican district there up in Scott's neck of the woods, and Evangeline Hundley at 35.38%. Again, solid Republican district there. House District 7, we're talking about the PD and the Grand Strand with Russell Fry in that new 7th congressional district that's been on the books now for a few years. And he is leading Mal Hyman there, 62 to 37%. Again, these are some districts here, Kirk, that were kind of foregone conclusions. I don't think Russell Fry even had a challenger in the primary, and so it's not too shocking. But like we're talking about with Scott, we're talking about the 1st congressional district. That race back in 2022, Mace beat Democrat Dr. Annie Andrews by 14 points. She's up against Michael B. Moore, who's the Democrat. Moore is the former CEO of the International African American Museum. I'm guessing we're going to be somewhere. We're watching the margins at this point, right? Because it was such an expensive race, but it's also kind of set in a way.
Yeah, I think for Nancy Mace and her election, you have a combination of sort of the last 4 years, and she has been at times an outspoken critic of the Republican Party. She was one of the group that voted to oust Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House. That drew a lot of ire and anger against her from fellow Republicans. And so there were questions about whether she would survive a primary challenge. Obviously she did. There were questions then, does that affect her in the general election? And so that one is still kind of a question mark. I think she will likely prevail tonight, but really the question becomes, by what margin? If it is a relatively narrow margin, well, she survived. She has another 2 years in office, but that may not bode well for the next election in 26. And so that's part of what I'm looking at is what those numbers look like at the end.
She raised $2.9 million in this race. This is the most expensive race in the cycle. Spent $2.5 million, has about $620,000 on hand just because some carried over from the previous cycle. Moore raised $1 million, spent $942,000, has about $82,000. So this was the most expensive race in our congressional delegation here too. But when we talk about that map too, Kirk, we're talking about that redrawing of it, right? So back in 2020, when Mace was first elected, she narrowly beat Joe Cunningham, who was the Democrat incumbent who flipped that district for the first time in decades. She beat him by 1.2 points. And like we said with Annie Andrews, she beat her by 14 points in 2022 with that new map. So we're expecting to see kind of what we're talking about, somewhere in the teens, somewhere in the double digits, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why if her margin of victory is anything less than above 10%, that is going to be a shock to me, and that's kind of what I'm looking for. But I expect that she will probably prevail somewhere in the the low teens again, similar to what she did 2 years ago.
And Scott, when we talk about Nancy Mason, she's a big vocal supporter of Donald Trump. She takes to social media a lot. She can be pretty much a firebrand too on cable news networks when she's on. She's really made a name for herself in some respects. She spoke at the Republican National Convention out there in Milwaukee. She survived this primary challenge. She has survived past primary challenges. Does this really solidify Nancy Mason, that first congressional district?
She has a strong base there, but when you are that outspoken, you make yourself a target for, getting primaried by people who are unhappy with you. She makes enemies just as easily as she makes friends. She can be very controversial. So, how popular she is today, that could fundamentally change by the time 2026 rolls around. That's a safe Republican district. It's going to remain a safe Republican district. But Nancy Mace, and she wants to be a loose cannon, and she can be a loose cannon. Whether or not she maintains her strong base, that remains to be seen. But right now, she's got it. As Kirk said, she's going to get double digits, low double digits, but double-digit win. Whether or not she can hang on to that or talk herself out of any leadership position or anything in the House, we'll see.
Okay, Scott, thanks for that. And we're going to go to the Republican Party watch party where we have the governor speaking to the crowd, Governor Henry McMaster and First Lady Peggy McMaster.
Y'all, I want to thank you. This party, since I've been involved, has really grown. I remember I was party chairman when in 1994, we developed a plan. We put it into practice. We had everybody working. Everybody knew what they were supposed to do. And that was that evening when the final vote is Ron Fleming's vote came in. That gave us 60 votes in the House. And 62 and 62 makes it even Steven. And we knew that there was some that were going to switch if we got close. And they did. And that's when we won that majority. It wasn't but a few years after that we won the majority in the Senate. And then we won the majority in all the constitutional offices. And we've been growing and growing ever since. And I'll tell you the main reason why, the core of it, is because not only do we love America, but we really do love America. We really do. We don't just say we do. And we understand that when we were ruled by the king had all the power, so we wanted to get rid of that. So we had a revolution, which was won in South Carolina. This is where it won. The last shot was fired up in New England, but this is where it was won when we defeated the Southern strategy of the most powerful empire in the world, and that was the British Empire. But we established a constitution. I ask the children sometimes, what rights does the Constitution of the United States give you? And some of them are very bright. So the right for freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. I said, no, children. The Constitution does not give you any rights. The Constitution was created by the states to protect those rights that your God gave you from this new government that we are creating. We understand that. And when you start from that premise, then you will see, as a vivid example in the Biden administration, all these mandates, there's no authority anywhere in that Constitution for what they were doing. That's why they didn't work. Every time the federal government steps outside of the bounds of what was carefully prescribed in the Constitution, that's when we get into trouble. So the power, the imagination, the future of this country, to all together with the states, creates the United States of America, which is the greatest country the world has ever seen. But don't ever forget that it starts right here where you're standing, right in your shoes. That is where the power of this country rests, in your shoes and in your heart. That's where it is. So I want to thank all of you for doing what you do. Nobody's paying you to do all this. A lot of times it's a lot of trouble. But by golly, it is necessary. I remember Jack Kemp used to say, you got to get out of the stands and get on the field. Well, we're on the field, and it is a field of battle, and it takes a toll. But ladies and gentlemen, we are winning, and we're going to keep on winning, and thank you for winning in South Carolina.
That's a good little pep talk there from Governor Henry McMaster to the Republican Watch Party here in Columbia. And like we said, it's about just 40 minutes after the polls have closed here in South Carolina. Kirk, we just heard from the governor there giving that pep talk, like I said. I spoke with him earlier today when him and the First Lady voted here in Columbia, and I asked him if he was worried about political violence or any issues with voter integrity. And he said, I think we've been through so much of that in the last election. Frankly, I think people are probably tired of it when it comes to this talk of political violence. But we've been talking a lot about folks being apprehensive. There's a lot of anxiety. Some might say even more so than we've seen in past elections. What's your read been like? What are you picking up on when you talk to your students in the classroom or other folks out there in the public?
So first of all, let me say, I hope the governor is right that there is no political violence, because there's absolutely no room for violence in any of this. Unfortunately, I am much more pessimistic than the governor is. And I think part of that is we have seen rhetoric repeated constantly that stokes the anger and preys on the fears of individuals. We see reports of buildings, especially in Washington, D.C., that are boarding up as if there's a hurricane that's coming, because they're afraid that there's going to be violence on the streets and there's going to be a lot of damage done. And then I think we still have images of January 6th that very much are in people's minds. And Scott mentioned this earlier in our broadcast. This was the first time ever that we had not seen a peaceful transfer of power, and the first time that we had seen an insurrection storm the Capitol and break into that building. And prior to January 6th, I don't think there was anybody that would have imagined something like that would have even been possible. Certainly political scientists like Scott and myself never would have expected something like that in the United States. And we look at this in other countries and think, yep, we could see it happening there, but not here. And so all of that combined, I think, has everybody on edge. Everybody's just sort of buckling in and hoping for the best. But I think we're also kind of preparing for the worst.
And Scott, before we get to some new numbers, can you just jump in on that too? I mean, does this ever go down, or does this just keep ramping up regardless of what happens tonight?
Well, it's going to keep ramping up this election cycle. Whether or not it continues, a lot of that's going to depend on how much the parties change. I don't know that we're heading for a true realignment in the specific little way that we political scientists define it, but the parties are changing. Especially the Republican Party is absolutely not the party of Eisenhower. It's not even the party of Ronald Reagan anymore. It's a fundamentally different party. It's not as about free trade as it used to be. There's a lot of government deregulation, but this is not your father's Republican Party. And so what that means for how people react to elections, the outcome, that's kind of up in the air. When we teach our institutions class going forward, there's the potential for a lot of it to change. Governor McMaster talked about the Constitution, saying it was very prescribed about what's allowed. It's actually really not. Executive power shall be vested in a president. It does not define that. Our Constitution is beautiful in its brevity, but that brevity also lends itself to wide interpretation over the past couple of hundred years, and it leaves a lot of room for whoever is in power to use that. And we could see the executive branch especially be fundamentally altered depending on who comes into power. So that, I think, in and of itself means that more folks are going to be concerned, anxious, and worry about what's going forward.
Yeah, a little bit opposite there than what was being projected by the governor, but of course that's the reality in so many ways too. But we have some new numbers here we're going to look at right now when it comes to the presidential race. Some counties coming in there right now. Nothing too surprising here when we look at how the map is filling out in South Carolina, with former President Trump leading at 58% to Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris at 41%. And that's just 4% of the expected vote right now, just some of the counties trickling in. And we'll be moving on to some more numbers here. In the U.S. House District 3, with Brian Best at 31, about 32% there. He's the Democrat in the district, in the 3rd district, where Sherry Biggs is leading at 65%. She's about to be the newest congressional member to our 7-person delegation in the House. In House District 5, we have Ralph Norman leading Evangeline Hunley, 65 to 35%. And then in Jim Clyburn's 6th congressional district here in the Midlands down to the Low Country, he's at about 57% to Duke Buckner at 40%. So nothing too shocking there for Congressman Clyburn. And then up in the PD and the Grand Strand, the 7th congressional district with Russell Fry, the Republican, the incumbent there at 55% to Mal Hyman at 44%. So nothing too surprisingly shocking there. We are talking about Congressman Jim Clyburn, the only Democrat in the 7-member House district here, Kirk, in our delegation. And he is going for, let me double check which term he's going. He's going for his 17th term. He's been there since 1993, the only Democrat in the congressional delegation. Duke Buckner's a Republican trying to challenge him there. But again, we want to talk about how there's no real surprises in those other 6 congressional districts, potentially. No surprise there for Congressman Clyburn.
No, Congressman Clyburn, I think, is just an institution unto South Carolina. People know him. I think people respect him on both sides of the aisle. He has, held leadership positions within the Democratic Party. He has conducted himself, I think, with the utmost integrity, and I am not surprised to see him with a very comfortable margin, and I think he will sail to victory at the end of the night.
Mm-hmm. Scott, that kind of goes hand in hand. We see Clyburn, who was such, he basically helped deliver South Carolina for Joe Biden back in 2020 in that Democratic primary, that February primary. It was huge for him getting that endorsement from Clyburn at the time. Then obviously things changed there with the vice president taking over, with the president standing down at the end of July. And then also likewise with the Governor McMaster, he endorsed, Lieutenant Governor McMaster at the time, I should say, endorsed Donald Trump early on back in the 2016 race. And that has paid dividends, just like Clyburn and his relationship with the White House has paid dividends. So it seems like almost whoever gets in the White House, South Carolina benefits in some way, shape, or form.
Well, we're always going to have some type of leadership in there because of the longevity of our members of Congress, and that is, of course, due to gerrymandering. Jim Clyburn, the district was drawn as a majority-minority district. When it has gotten redrawn again and again, he has happily accepted a blue precinct here and a blue precinct there from the red districts around him. That has just made his seat safer, and he has used that in a way that made him incredibly important to the Democratic Party. He has been an institution, will continue to be an institution for the Democratic Party and the leadership. And those connections to the White House kind of run deep. I mean, you're always hearing about something in South Carolina related to the White House, whether it's Nancy Mace and her feuds or love fest with Trump, depending on what day it is. Joe Wilson screaming "you lie" at Obama. You are always going to see South Carolina in the mix because we tend to keep our representatives. Look at how much power Lindsey Graham has had. He may not be riding the highest among Republicans in the state, but he is safe, and he has been there for a long time. And before him, I think Strom Thurmond held the seat for 200-300 years, and that kept him pretty solid in power with his party as well, even though he flipped parties in the 60s.
Yeah, and Fritz Hollings, too, was in there for a long time, too. But, of course, we saw Tim Scott, who was a Republican presidential candidate at one point during this cycle. I mean, this has been a long cycle. So was former Republican Governor Nikki Haley, who's also a candidate in this cycle. You saw Tim Scott hitting the campaign trail more than Nikki Haley. She never seemed to have gotten deployed, Kirk, which some would say would maybe be to Trump's detriment, especially when you saw her actually picking up votes in Pennsylvania, I should say, the swing state of Pennsylvania, after she had dropped out after Super Tuesday.
Yeah, I think Nikki Haley, when she dropped out, she hit the nail on the head in that she basically told Donald Trump, you must earn the votes that otherwise came to me during the primary. And he essentially ignored that advice. And she campaigned basically on a message that was more optimistic, more about issues, less about personalities and culture and division. And That did not fit the campaign Donald Trump wanted to run. And also because Nikki Haley, even though she came out and said, yes, I will support Donald Trump, she did not bend the knee like other Republican candidates did. And I think there was, and probably still is, a fair bit of friction between Donald Trump and her, which is one of the reasons that he has not deployed her, as you said. Unlike, say, Kamala Harris, that has had a whole variety of individuals, not just within the Democratic Party, but also prominent Republicans like a Liz Cheney that have come out and joined her at rallies, spoken independently of her, and she has been able to put out basically a small army to get her message in front of the voters. And that's a missed opportunity, I think, that Donald Trump, it may come back to haunt him later on.
Yeah, Scott, pick up on that, because we did see the Harris campaign really going after those Haley voters there, too, knowing that the margins are so slim in these swing states like Pennsylvania. What is she looking for tonight? I mean, is she going to be waking up at some point when this race is called saying, I told you so, you guys should have listened to me. You know, you had these two candidates that were not perfect in the first place. You know, this is your fault. Or is she going to be asking Donald Trump to be a part of his administration again?
Well, you know, if she is right, and Donald Trump's kind of co-chairs of his campaign agreed with her, then he's going to have a missed opportunity. His co-chairs kept trying to put him on message the same way Nikki Haley stayed on message and suggested Trump stay on message. But Donald Trump is incapable of that because he has, you know, such a strong personality and he is so beloved by his supporters. He has made a lot of this about retribution. He says he wants to get in power and go after those folks who have come after him. He tells his supporters, they really want to come after you. I'm just in the way. And his co-chairs of his campaign, Nikki Haley, a lot of other folks said, you need to be hitting Biden and then Harris on the economy, on immigration, on the issues where you have better leverage. And Donald Trump has not taken that advice. So if he wakes up and this campaign has been more about Donald Trump, less about the issues, and he loses, then Nikki Haley's going to be in a position to say, you know, I told the party which direction it should go. It didn't listen, and here we are. In a new Trump administration, not sure what role she would have, given that, you know, she went up against Donald Trump in the primaries, but we've seen Donald Trump enemies become friends and then back to enemies and back and forth in the past. So who can tell?
Yeah, it's difficult to say in this political environment. Really quick.
But I do say, and Scott, I think, started hitting on this point. So Donald Trump really, since the campaign is about him and his personality, it's very difficult for him to cede control to other individuals. I mean, you saw J.D. Vance did a town hall, and Donald Trump called into it to ask a question about himself. And Kamala Harris has been much more willing to let people just speak on her behalf. And I think that's an image that will play very starkly.
And we're going to be wrapping up here because we have about 5 minutes left. And I want to jump to Maayan Schechter, who's at the Republican Watch Party here in Columbia, for some final thoughts on what's going on there. Hey, Maayan.
The crowd is still growing here at Tin Roof, right across from the South Carolina Statehouse. We just heard from Drew McKissick, the chair of the South Carolina Republican Party, followed by Governor Henry McMaster and Congressman Joe Wilson, who already has declared victory, despite I haven't seen any AP results from here as of yet. But like I said earlier, this is a crowd that is very, very confident about where the results are going to be, particularly as it relates to how former President Trump is going to do in South Carolina, how the Republicans running for the U.S. House of Representatives. And as you heard tonight, Drew McKissick is very, very confident that not only will South Carolina Republicans flip 2 seats in the South Carolina Senate and 2 seats in the South Carolina House of Representatives, but they may double that just from the sheer population changes that we've seen and also the excitement at the top of the ticket. So again, I expect this crowd to stay and linger for a long time. I can tell you, I don't know when the last time Governor McMaster was here at Tin Roof. Did not have a chance to ask him, but this is an excited crowd, and we'll be here I'll be here for a little bit longer. Back to you, Gavin.
Sounds like quite the party there and quite the story coming out when it comes to the Statehouse and what we're hearing in some momentum. But we want to go over to the Democrat Watch Party with Alicia Eady, who's also in Columbia, to get some final thoughts. Hey, Alicia.
Hey, Gavin. So our cozy space here at the Beer Keller Brewing Company in Columbia is gathering and filling up with a lot of supporters. But I think tonight, Gavin, is also about, of course, watching the returns and hopefully celebrating with Democrats. But also, I think it's also a night of outreach as well. Earlier, when we talked with the chair of the South Carolina Democratic Party, Crystal Spain, she talked about tomorrow, what happens tomorrow, and how she wants for residents and citizens to volunteer year-round so that they can actually make change and have an impact in the party. Well, there are a lot of young voters here today, and I had the chance to speak with the chair of an organization who works with voters 14 to 39 years of age, and they're out here in full strength. So I think tonight here at the Beer Keller Brewing Company in Columbia, a night of celebration and watching these results with Democrats, but also a night of outreach and connecting with those younger voters here in South Carolina. But we're going to have to wait and see. So back to you.
Yes, thanks, Alicia. We will be waiting and seeing for a good while. That's Alicia Eady at the Democratic Watch Party and Maayan Schechter at the Republican Watch Party, both here in Columbia. Thanks, guys. And again, it's almost been an hour since the polls have closed in South Carolina. We're still waiting for some numbers to come in fully, but we have some already, we can tell you. And we're going to look at those now with the presidential race. It's 60% so far for Donald Trump in South Carolina and 39% for Vice President Kamala Harris, should say former President Donald Trump. And we're seeing those numbers come in. It's 10% they're reporting at this point. And then the first congressional district down the Low Country with Nancy Mace, the incumbent Republican, there at 60%, and the Democratic challenger Michael B. Moore at right around 40%. Again, these are still early numbers. It's only been about an hour since the polls have closed. We are still waiting to hear some AP race calls because we are waiting for the Associated Press to make these calls before we do. But we can already report that the AP is calling Kentucky, Indiana, and West Virginia for Donald Trump, as well as Vermont for Vice President Kamala Harris. So no real surprises there when it comes to these state race calls. We're waiting for them to call South Carolina, which should be pretty imminent, but we're almost out of time here. So with that being said, Kirk, anything that you'll be watching as the night goes on, or should we just say we're going to wake up and see what happens and maybe get some sleep instead?
I think it's just buckle in because it's going to be a good couple of days before we know with any degree of certainty how this turned out.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Scott? Are you staying up all night, or what should we be doing in the hours ahead?
I'm absolutely not staying up all night. Keep an eye on Pennsylvania. You have a high turnout in Philadelphia. It's good for the Democrats. If in the surrounding suburban counties, those are stronger for Trump, then that's better for Trump and bad for Harris. Strong turnout in Charlotte is good for Harris in North Carolina. In general, Kirk pointed this out earlier, it's not going to be done counting tonight or even tomorrow. Just chill out a little bit and let's let the process go.
Gotcha. That's a good little word of wisdom there from Scott Huffman, who's a Winthrop Political Science professor up there at Winthrop University. I'm here in studio with Kirk Randazzo at University of South Carolina. A lot to watch. We're still standing by and waiting for some more numbers to come in, very early numbers so far. It's only been about an hour since polls have closed in South Carolina, and we're waiting to see what happens. But we'll be updating you throughout the next couple hours here before we go to the PBS NewsHour live coverage of the election. And I just want to say a special thanks to all of our guests in studio and out there in the field, including Alicia Eady and Maayan Schechter out there at those watch parties here in Columbia. And for everyone at South Carolina ETV and South Carolina Public Radio, I'm Gavin Jackson. Good night and stay tuned.